On the morning of my 67th birthday, my daughter-in-law handed me a manila envelope and told me it would be best if I found somewhere else to live. She didn't yell. She didn't even raise her voice. She just set it down on the kitchen table in front of me, right next to my coffee cup, and said it the way you'd tell someone the weather had changed. Matter of fact. Calm. Like she'd rehearsed it enough times that it didn't feel like anything anymore. My son was standing in the doorway. He didn't say a word. I sat there with my hands around that mug, and I thought about the deed to this house, tucked inside the fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet. The deed with my name on it, only my name. And I decided to open the envelope. Let me back up, because none of this started on my birthday. It started 3 years earlier, in the fall, when my son called me from Denver and told me things were tight. He's my youngest. I have 2 kids. My daughter lives out in Portland with her husband and their 3 girls, and she calls every Sunday without fail. My son is different. He's always been the one who needed a little more runway. Not because he's lazy, he isn't, but because he never quite figured out how to land. He'd start something, pour himself into it, and then something would shift, and he'd have to start over. I watched it happen with the restaurant idea, with the real estate license, with the landscaping business. He and a buddy tried to get off the ground in his late 20s. Each time he'd dust himself off and try again, and I respected that about him. I still do. When he called that fall, he'd just come off a bad stretch. He'd been working in logistics management for a company that got swallowed up in a merger, and half the staff got cut. His wife had a part-time position at a dental office, but it wasn't enough to cover their rent and the rest of it. They had 2 kids in elementary school by then, my grandchildren. A 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. He asked if they could stay with me for a while, just until he got back on his feet. I live in a 4-bedroom house in central Ohio, outside of Columbus. My wife, Sandra, passed away 4 years before that call. She and I bought this house in 1991, raised both our kids here, put a garden in the backyard that she tended until she got too sick to kneel down in the dirt. After she died, I kept the garden going because it felt like the right thing to do. I mowed the lawn myself, fixed what needed fixing, paid the property taxes and the homeowner's insurance and the utility bills every month without thinking much about it. It was just the house. My house. The house my kids grew up in. When my son called, I didn't hesitate. Come on, I told him. There's plenty of room. They arrived in November, right before Thanksgiving. My son, his wife, and my 2 grandkids with their backpacks and their tablets, and a hamster in a plastic carrier that my daughter-in-law apologized for the moment she walked in the door. I told her not to worry about the hamster. The first few months were good. Not perfect. Nothing with 6 people under one roof ever is, but good. My grandkids filled up the house in the way that houses need to be filled. They left their shoes in the hallway and drew pictures at the kitchen table. And asked me to watch cartoons with them on Saturday mornings. And I did. Every time. My son was sending out resumes, taking calls in the guest room with the door shut, staying up late on his laptop. His wife was working her hours at the dental office and picking the kids up from school and cooking dinner most nights, which I appreciated even when it meant my kitchen smelled like whatever spice she was heavy-handed with that week. There were adjustments. Of course there were. She had opinions about the house. Strong ones, expressed in the gentle way that isn't quite gentle. That way where someone says I was just thinking before they tell you what they think is wrong with how you've always done things. She thought the living room furniture was dated. She thought the guest bathroom needed new fixtures. She thought the backyard would look better without Sandra's garden, which she called a lot of upkeep for not a lot of return. I let most of it go. They were guests. Guests have opinions, and that's fine. What I didn't do, and I've thought about this 100 times since, was sit my son down and say clearly and plainly, "This is my house, it is not yours, and when you're back on your feet, you'll need to find your own place." I thought it went without saying. I thought he knew. He grew up here. He watched his mother and me pay bills at this table for 18 years. He knew whose name was on the deed. Apparently, somewhere along the way, that understanding got lost. It was about 18 months in when I first noticed something had shifted. Small things at first. My daughter-in-law started referring to the house as our home when she talked to the neighbors. I heard her on the front porch one afternoon, telling the woman who lives across the street about her plans to repaint the exterior. She said, "We're thinking of going with a gray-blue, something more modern. Not my father-in-law is thinking about repainting. We." I told myself I was reading too much into it. Then she started moving things. Sandra's china cabinet got relocated to the basement. She said it blocked the natural light in the dining room, and she wasn't wrong, technically, but she didn't ask me. She just came home one Saturday with my son and a furniture dolly she'd borrowed from a neighbor, and they moved it without mentioning it to me beforehand. When I pointed out that it had belonged to my wife, she said she understood that and that it would be safer in the basement, away from the kids. That night I lay in bed and tried to decide if I was being unreasonable. My son had found work by then. A decent position with a distribution company. Not as much as he'd been making before, but steady. I'd expected that once he was back on his feet, they'd start looking for a place of their own. He never brought it up. When I mentioned it once, lightly, he said things were still tight, that they were saving up, that it made more sense to wait until the kids finished the school year. I said okay. I didn't push. I should have pushed. The thing about being a father is that you want to believe the best. You raise this person. You remember every version of them. The kid who cried when his goldfish died. The teenager who stayed up all night before his SATs. The young man who called you from the hospital when his first child was born and couldn't get words out for a full minute because he was so overwhelmed. You remember all of that. And when you start to see something that troubles you, you make excuses because the alternative is admitting that the person you raised is capable of something you don't want to think about. I made excuses for a long time. I made excuses when my daughter-in-law started talking to a real estate agent. I didn't find out directly. I heard her on the phone one evening when I came downstairs for water, and she was in the kitchen, speaking quietly, talking about the property and comparable sales in the area and our timeline. She stopped when she heard me on the stairs, said she'd call back, and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I said good evening and got my water and went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name is Paul. He handled Sandra's estate, and he's been my lawyer for over 20 years. I told him what I'd heard. He asked me a few questions, methodical and calm, the way he always is. Then he told me something that I think about every time I catch myself, assuming people understand things that should be obvious. He said, "There are people who confuse living somewhere with owning somewhere, especially when no one has drawn the line clearly." He advised me to do nothing yet, to watch, to document, and to make sure my legal affairs were in order. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly putting things in place. I updated my will, reviewed the deed, and had a conversation with my attorney about what my options would be if it came to that. I didn't tell my son. I didn't confront my daughter-in-law. I just got ready. The way my own father used to say, you should always get ready before the storm, not during it. The storm came on a Tuesday evening in March, about 2.5 years after they'd moved in. I'd come home from a late afternoon walk. I do 3 miles most days, doctor's orders after a minor cardiac event the year before. And when I came through the back door, I could hear them talking in the living room. Not arguing, just talking. But something in the tone made me stop. My daughter-in-law was saying something about a closing date. My son was asking about the kids' school situation and whether they'd be switching districts. I stood in the kitchen and I listened. She'd found a buyer. She had a real estate agent. They had a closing date set for 6 weeks out, and they were discussing whether they'd need to ask me to vacate before the sale or after. Vacate. She used that word. About the house I'd owned for 33 years. I set my keys down on the counter very quietly. I walked into the living room and I stood in the doorway, and they both turned around. My daughter-in-law recovered first. She gave me that smile again. "We were just talking," she said, "about some things we've been thinking about." "I heard," I said. There was a silence. My son looked at the floor. He's always done that when he's ashamed of something. Looked at the floor the same way he did at age 9 when I caught him lying about breaking a neighbor's window with a baseball. Dad, he started. Let her finish, I said, not unkindly. I just wanted to hear it said out loud. My daughter-in-law straightened her shoulders. She had this look that I'd seen before on people who have convinced themselves that they're being reasonable while doing something that isn't. She said that they'd been here long enough that they felt this was their home now. She said that the house was more than big enough to have been a shared space, and that's essentially how they treated it. She said that they had 2 children who were settled in their schools and their routines, and that moving into a place of their own made sense, and that the equity from a sale would set them up properly. She said, and this is the part that I won't forget, that they'd already found a nice apartment nearby for me. 1 bedroom, senior-friendly, good community, a 1-bedroom apartment for my 67-year-old self. In the house I bought when I was 34 years old. I looked at my son the whole time she was talking. He kept his eyes down. When she finished, I nodded slowly. I want to show you something, I said. I went upstairs to my bedroom. I opened the closet, moved the winter coats aside, and lifted the fireproof lockbox off the shelf. I brought it back downstairs, set it on the coffee table, and opened it with the small key I keep on my keychain. I took out the document on top, the deed to the property, recorded with the Franklin County Recorder's Office, dated 1991, with both my name and Sandra's name on it. After Sandra passed, I'd had it updated. Now it had only my name. I held it out toward my daughter-in-law. She took it, read it, set it on the coffee table. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Well, you could have told us. I want you to sit with that for a second. You could have told us." Told them what? Exactly. That I owned my own home, that the house they'd moved into as guests was not, in fact, theirs, that somewhere in the universe there is an order of things, and a man's name on a county deed is part of that order. I thought you knew, I said. My son finally looked up, and I saw something in his face that I recognized as shame, not because of what they'd done, not yet, but because he knew, on some level, that he'd known. He'd always known. He'd just let things drift until they became something he couldn't control, which is, I realize now, something I'd watched him do his whole life. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry." His wife put her hand on his arm. "We should talk about this like adults," she said. "We are," I told her. "That's exactly what we're doing." What happened after that was not dramatic. At least not in the way I think people imagine when they hear a story like this. There was no screaming. No one threw anything. My daughter-in-law asked some questions, mostly practical ones about timelines and what I expected from them, and I answered them honestly. I told them I wasn't asking them to leave tomorrow. I told them I understood that they had children and that we would handle this in a way that was decent and fair. I also told them, clearly and without softness, that this house was not for sale. It was not changing hands. And the conversation about closing dates was over. My son nodded. He looked like a man who was slowly understanding the full weight of something he'd been avoiding. His wife was quiet for the rest of the evening. That night, I called my daughter in Portland and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Dad, I'm so sorry you've been carrying this." That was the moment I cried. Not during the confrontation, not when I held out the deed, not when my son apologized, but at midnight, on the phone with my daughter, hearing her say, "I'm sorry you've been carrying this." Because I had been. I'd been carrying it quietly for months, the way I'd been trained my whole life to carry things, without making too much of a fuss, without wanting to be a burden, without wanting to cause problems in my own house. My own house. My son and his family moved out about 6 weeks later. He found a rental not far away, a 3-bedroom in a decent school district, which I was glad about for my grandchildren's sake. The move itself was polite but careful, the way things are when everyone is being precise about what they say so nothing comes out wrong. On the day they loaded the last boxes, my son hugged me at the door. A real hug, not a quick one. He said, "I love you, Dad. I'm sorry. I know you are," I told him. I meant it. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who haven't been in something like this. That loving your child and being hurt by your child can exist in exactly the same moment, with exactly the same weight. I was hurt. I am still hurt, if I'm honest. I don't think that goes away quickly. Maybe it doesn't go away fully, ever. But I also know my son, the real him underneath the avoidance and the mistakes. And I believe that man is capable of being better. I have to believe that, because the alternative is too hard. His wife and I don't have much of a relationship now. She comes to family events, Thanksgiving, the kids' birthdays, and we're civil. We're always civil. But there's a distance there that I don't expect to close. She made choices that I've chosen to forgive, in the way that forgiveness is really a thing you do for yourself, not for the other person. I released the anger, because I didn't want to spend whatever years I have left feeding it. But I haven't forgotten, and I'm not pretending. A few things changed after they left. I put Sandra's china cabinet back in the dining room. I stood in the doorway for a while and just looked at it, the light coming through the window the way it did when she was still here, hitting the glass doors and scattering across the wall in a way I'd forgotten about. I'd forgotten because, for the better part of a year, it had been in the basement. I planted new things in the garden that spring, tomatoes and basil, and 2 kinds of peppers, the way Sandra used to do. My neighbor's teenage daughter came over one Saturday and asked if she could help, and we spent the whole afternoon out there. She asked me about the garden, and I told her about Sandra. And I talked about my wife in the open way I hadn't been able to do in years, and it felt good. It felt like coming back to something. My daughter came to visit that summer with her family, and we sat on the back porch 2 nights in a row after the kids went to bed, just talking, the way we used to. The house felt like mine again in a way I hadn't quite realized I'd been missing. I think that's the thing people don't always understand about a situation like this. It's not just about a legal document. It's not just about money or property. It's about the space where you've lived your life, the walls that have your history in them, the room where you sat with your wife while she was sick and held her hand and told her you'd be okay even when you weren't sure. That space means something. You don't hand it over because someone else has decided it's more convenient for them. You don't owe anyone your home. I still see my grandchildren regularly, every other weekend or so. We go to the park, or I take them to the Science Museum downtown. Or they come over and we make pancakes on Saturday mornings the way they used to when they lived here. They're good kids. None of this is their fault, and I've been careful, very careful, to make sure they never feel caught in the middle. When my grandson asked me once why Grandma's cabinet was back in the dining room, I told him it looked better there, and that was enough for him. He's 10. He doesn't need the rest of it. My son and I talk on the phone most weeks. We're finding our way back to each other, slowly. We had a long conversation about 6 months after they moved out. The kind of conversation we probably should have had years earlier, about expectations and communication, and what happens when you let things go unsaid for too long. He told me he'd been afraid to push back on his wife, and I told him that I understood fear, but that being a good person sometimes requires you to say the hard thing out loud. He agreed. He looked like he meant it. I'm not naive. I know that a conversation doesn't undo everything, but I also know that my son is someone I raised and someone I love, and someone who, when given the chance, has it in him to show up better. I'm going to keep believing that until he proves me wrong. I turned 68 last October. I had a small birthday dinner here at the house. My daughter and her family drove up from Portland. My son and the grandkids came over, my neighbor and a couple of old friends. We ate too much and stayed up past 10, which for this group is practically an event. My daughter gave a little toast that made me laugh and made me teary at the same time. Afterward, when everyone had left and I was washing up in the kitchen, I looked through the window over the sink at Sandra's garden in the dark, and I thought about the year that had passed and the 3 years before it, and everything they'd cost me. And then I dried my hands, turned off the kitchen light, and walked through my house, past the china cabinet in the dining room, past the family photos on the hallway wall, past the room where my grandkids sleep when they stay over. And I went upstairs to bed, my house, my life. Still mine. That was enough.